Welcome back, all you terrific Tap Tigers, and thanks for tuning in. On this episode, we're going to discuss juvenile justice in Georgia. So, what is a juvenile? A juvenile in the state of Georgia are children who are under the age of 17 and who are said to have committed delinquent acts or status offenses, also known as unruly behaviors. Or a juvenile is any child under 18 who is considered deprived, meaning that they are not being taken care of by their family, given proper food, clothing, and shelter. So now we have to discuss the difference between delinquent acts and status offenses or unruly behavior. So you probably have, in some form or another, heard someone referred to as a juvenile delinquent. Well, a delinquent juvenile is one who, when they commit an act that would be considered a crime if it was committed by an adult, then that act is a delinquent act. So an example of a juvenile delinquent behavior is the possession of drugs. Also, theft, assault, rape, and murder. So again, these are crimes that if they were committed by an adult, they would be considered a crime. And also, if a juvenile's delinquent act is serious enough, she or he could be charged as an adult. On the other side, there are status offenses or unruly behaviors. These acts are things that would not be considered a crime if committed by an adult. For example, if an adult runs away from home, it's just called leaving. But if you're a juvenile, it's called running away. Skipping school. Well, generally, adults that are in school are probably either at the end of high school or they're paying for college. And it's not called skipping if you're paying for it. If you were caught driving without a license, possession of alcohol or cigarettes, vaping devices, or breaking curfew, those are status offenses or unruly behavior. Now, I know you're probably thinking, what is a curfew? Who has a curfew? All of Georgia has a curfew for juveniles. Bet you didn't know that. Well, you need to know it because that curfew states that on school nights, that's Sundays through Thursdays, juveniles need to be in the home by 11 p.m. unless accompanied by an adult. On Friday and Saturday, that's midnight. Now, Powder Springs, where you live, could have a different statute. So I would really advise you to check out what the curfew is for juveniles in Powder Springs. But those are the two types of behaviors that a juvenile can exhibit where they would come under the jurisdiction, if you remember that from our last lesson, the purview or the area of control. If a juvenile commits either a delinquent act or an unruly behavior, she or he would come under the jurisdiction of the juvenile court system. So in the state of Georgia, again, juveniles fall under the jurisdiction of the juvenile court system unless that juvenile is being charged as an adult. And you can see here on the right, this is the mission statement put forth by the Department of Juvenile Justice. And they state that their mission is to protect and serve the citizens of Georgia by holding young offenders accountable for their actions through the delivery of services and sanctions in appropriate settings, and by supporting youth in their communities to become productive and law-abiding citizens. So if you look back over here, the juvenile court has several goals. Their first and foremost goal is always to return a minor or a juvenile to their parent's supervision. The juvenile courts do not want to put juveniles in jail or youth detention center if they don't have to. They always want to find a way to provide rehabilitation for the minors. And again, that comes back over here to helping youth become productive and law-abiding citizens. So they want to find ways to rehabilitate minors. Also, for those deprived juveniles, the court wants to make sure that juveniles are protected and taken care of. So those are different ways, and those are the goals of the juvenile court system. Number one, to rehabilitate children, juveniles. Number two, to return them to their parents. And number three, to make sure that juveniles are being taken care of by their family. So as a juvenile, you have some specific rights in the state of Georgia. If a juvenile commits an act or a delinquent act, he or she is not arrested, they are taken into custody. Now, if it was an adult, they would be placed under arrest. But in the juvenile system, you are taken into custody if you have committed an act, be it delinquent or unruly. So if you are taken into custody, these are the rights you have as a juvenile in our state. So first, you have the right to have a parent or guardian contacted immediately. You have the right to have a parent or guardian and an attorney present before being questioned. You, as a juvenile, have the right to be represented by an attorney should you have to go to a trial or a hearing. You have the right, if you are a juvenile, to not be placed with adult offenders. So if you were taken into custody and taken to the county jail, they would have to separate you from the adult criminals or the accused adults. Lastly, as a juvenile, you have the right to not have your name or photograph released to the public if you commit a delinquent act. The only time that is waived is if you commit a crime and are being charged as an adult. In that case, you are going to possibly have your name and picture put into the newspaper. So there are steps in the juvenile justice system, and they're different from the adult justice system. But if a juvenile commits a delinquent act in Georgia, she or he would go through the following steps. First, they would be taken into custody, which is similar to an arrest. Then, the juvenile would be taken to an intake officer. That intake officer is going to decide if there's enough evidence to charge and hold the juvenile. If they choose, then the intake officer can either press the charges or they can dismiss the charges and send the juvenile home. So they can either detain or release to the parent or guardian. If a juvenile is detained in a youth detention center or an adult jail, depending on the crime, there must be a hearing before a judge within 72 hours to determine if the proceedings should continue or if the juvenile can be released. So it has to happen within 4 days. If you are taken into custody, you have to go before a judge within 4 days. Informal adjustment comes next. And an informal adjustment, this is an optional step if a juvenile is a first-time offender. If the juvenile admits to the guilt, the judge can place the juvenile under court supervision for 90 days. Now, again, that's an optional step if a juvenile is a first-time offender. The next step would be, this one's a tough one to say, an adjudicatory hearing. Adjudicatory. Under this step, the judge determines if the juvenile is guilty or innocent. There is no jury in a juvenile case unless the juvenile is being charged as an adult. If there is a finding of guilt in the adjudicatory hearing, then the next step would be a disposition hearing. In this step, the judge will listen to witnesses and will determine the punishment. If the juvenile is going to be punished, she or he will go to their sentencing, and this is when the judge gives the actual punishment. Now, for a juvenile, punishments can include fines, probation, boot camp, YDC, and or mandatory counseling. There also could be house arrest in which a student or a juvenile might have to wear an ankle monitor. Lastly, if a juvenile is found guilty, she or he has the right to appeal the ruling if there is enough evidence to prove they were innocent of the crime they were found guilty for. Next is a series of photographs from a youth detention center. Here you can see where it looks like they come to eat and maybe have lessons. This would be looking into the different cells. This is what the inside of a cell looks like. These are juveniles that are being checked. And then lastly, juveniles do have to attend school while they are in custody. And if you can see on the back, it says DJJ. That means the Department of Juvenile Justice. So if you are placed into a youth detention center, a YDC, then you do have to attend classes while you're in custody. So what happens when juveniles are charged as an adult? There are certain crimes that juveniles between the age of 13 and 17 can commit that could have them charged as an adult. Some of those examples are murder, voluntary manslaughter, rape, and armed robbery with a firearm. In these cases, the offender or the defendant is placed under the jurisdiction of the Superior Court. Now, each of these is a felony. If you recall from our last lesson, all felonies fall under the jurisdiction of the Superior Court. In this case, if a defendant is found guilty, she or he receives the same sentence as an adult and must serve all jail time, 10 years minimum, in adult prison without the possibility of parole. She or he may file an appeal. Now, in 2005, the Supreme Court ruled that juveniles could not be given the death penalty as punishment. Before that, in the state of Georgia, it was possible if a juvenile committed some of these serious felonies, she or he could be given the death penalty. But in 2005, the Supreme Court said that was not, it was not constitutional. 5 years later, in 2010, the Supreme Court ruled that juveniles could not be sentenced to serve a life in prison punishment. So, especially for murder. So there are many cases that are now being reheard where new sentences are being placed on juveniles who were given either the death penalty or life in prison prior to 2005 and 2010. I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. In part 2, I will discuss with you the adult justice process, so you can see how it's a little bit different how adults are treated versus how juveniles are treated in the state of Georgia. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Rauscher out.